but I'm pretty sure about that. I thank the organizers and everybody who had helped to put this together, so in particular our friends at IIASA in Luxembourg, and many others and all the people who have worked and served on the steering committee. Of course, everybody has started to come here and has ventured into Potsdam. Just a few miles from here at the Klinike Bridge, more or less, the Cold War collapsed. So it's a very interesting place indeed. So, herewith I declare the first Impacts Olympics open. Now that was a joke, of course. Now, welcome everybody to this conference. Thanks for being here. I wish you all a very successful meeting. Thank you all.
I've now the pleasure to introduce to you Professor Sabine Kunst, who is the Minister for Science, Research and Culture of the Federal State of Brandenburg, where we are located in here. And she's also a professor for civil engineering and hydraulic engineering. Thank you for being here.
Dear Professor Schellnhuber, Mrs. Hedegaard, Mrs. Kyte, Professor Alcamo, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, warmly welcome to Potsdam. I would like to welcome you to the state of Brandenburg, both personally and on behalf of the Minister President of the Land of Brandenburg, Matthias Platzek. Unfortunately, he is unable to be here today, but sends warm regards to everyone. Climate change affects all of us to an extent that in everyday life often does not become obvious to us, even when we see the pictures of natural disasters on TV that are related to it. In most cases, the changes do not take place suddenly, but slowly and gradually. However, this does not make them any less threatening for us. Also, the basis of our life is affected here in Brandenburg as well as all over the world. Many things change which until now we thought to be unchanging. To mention only a few examples, agriculture and the regional water balance will be affected by temporal precipitation shifts. Our cities heat up, the risk of forest fires grows. Correspondingly, the challenges facing science, politics, and of course the economy are huge. When we talk about how we want to live tomorrow, the effects of climate change are one of the major factors which we have to take into account. On the one hand, we will have to adapt to the effects of climate change. We must be able to estimate as accurately as possible how the climate will change, which variations will be likely to occur, and in which periods of time these changes are to be expected. On the other hand, we have to counter and mitigate climate change as far as possible. To realize both goals, we need excellent cooperation and networking between science and politics. It is at this interface that we see your work here at the International Conference in Climate Change Effects. Today's conference is far from being the first scientific conference dealing with this issue. Particularly in the political sector, there have already been many efforts to arrive at global measures. In this respect, Rio de Janeiro and Kyoto are the names that first cross one's mind. Unfortunately, however, the success has so far been moderate. Yet it is all the more important that scientists keep on pointing out how climate change will affect our world and our life. Ladies and gentlemen, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research has particularly distinguished itself in this field. Headed by Professor Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, It has earned an outstanding reputation far beyond the borders of Germany, especially through its interdisciplinary approach. Obviously, this is not only a matter of science. Climate change has a social and an economic dimension as well. With this in mind, many thanks to Professor Schellnhuber and his team for organizing this important conference. I'm very happy that it takes place here in Brandenburg. It seems like to be a very good choice to me. Brandenburg is a high-performance science location, and Potsdam in particular is an important center of research and science. Hence, the conference venue has been well chosen. Moreover, a competitive structure in the sector of research and science is also an important factor for our economic development and, in the end, for the living standard of the people in Brandenburg. It is a condition for the creation of jobs with a long-term perspective and for the people here to be able to build a future for themselves. Therefore, the quality of Brandenburg as a science location contributes significantly to the opportunities for the entire region. Ladies and gentlemen, our energy policy in Brandenburg is of great importance for the development here. You are familiar with the debate about Germany's phasing out of nuclear power on the one hand and expanding the use of renewable forms of energy on the other hand. Brandenburg remains a leader in this development, not least indicated by the awards the land was happy to receive in recent years. The objectives of our policy in this field are threefold: ensure secure and clean energy supply, achieve stable prices, and aim for the high level of social acceptance. And that, I think, is a very important and also urgent point of discussion. It is my firm belief, without the people's acceptance, measures in favor of climate protection and the conservation of resources will not be successful. Scientific discoveries, economic development, and social issues cannot be considered independently from each other. The issue of climate change are indeed highly complex, not only because they are scientifically challenging, but also because they touch upon many aspects of our life. As stated at the beginning, climate change actually affects our daily life, right and now and today, but also with regard to future generations. I look forward to the results of your discussion in the next days and the recommendations for action that can be derived from them. In my opinion, the issues of local and regional actions are of particular importance in this context because it is probably easier to make progress at these levels than at supranational level. There, widely differing interests frequently play a part, which too often prevent progress. I wish you every success for the International Conference on Climate Change Effects and welcome you very warmly to Potsdam again. And of course, I suppose and hope that you can also enjoy the Glienicke Bridge and other, nice situations and places in Potsdam, their beauties and surroundings, and perhaps, of course, you will also enjoy your discussions and coming together. Nice days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kunst. And we now have the pleasure to receive a video message from His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales has developed a wide range of interests which are today reflected in the Prince's Charities, a group of non-for-profit organizations of which the Prince of Wales is patron or president. The group is the largest multi-case charitable enterprise in the United Kingdom, raising over £100 million annually. The organizations are active across a broad range of areas, including education and young people, environmental sustainability, the built environment, responsible business and enterprise.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to offer these few words to mark the opening of your vital meeting this week. Your endeavours to understand in detail the impacts of climate change simply could not be more important. And although I am extremely disappointed that I cannot be there with you in person, I do hope you will see some small merit in me appearing in such a low-carbon way. Far more appealing, I can assure you, than the alternative. Now, if I may, I would just like to express my admiration and profound gratitude to Professor Schellnhuber for having the prescience and indeed the courage to host this meeting. Your intention with this meeting, John, is both critically important and extremely timely. I'm afraid the need to respond to what seems like the never-ending economic crisis has pushed climate change down the global agenda. And given the requirement for what seems like continuous economic firefighting, this is perhaps understandable. But it seems to me, even in these profoundly difficult and challenging circumstances, we have to remember that, rather inconveniently, climate change is, to put it mildly, a risk multiplier. Now, as members of this audience will know far better than I, it is already making the current problems we are facing infinitely more difficult. And if we do not address the matter with great urgency, the problems will only be severely compounded. Tackling climate change is not an alternative to other priorities. It is a prerequisite. As you also know all too well, policymakers seem to need almost total accuracy on the risks that climate change brings. They need to know the degree of change that we can expect, the danger that will come when we breach critical climatic thresholds, and the action that we need to take to contain emissions beneath those thresholds. In other words, we are in the process of conducting a gigantic experiment. I must say, I have been immensely impressed by the tireless efforts of scientists across the world in piecing together the evidence needed to answer these questions, although I have to confess that some of their conclusions cause my blood to run cold. It seems there is no getting away from it now. We may truly be approaching the edge of disaster, as the scale of change we are causing on Earth is increasingly revealed as utterly unprecedented. That ever more alarming prospect, quite frankly, depresses me greatly, particularly given the imminent arrival of my first grandchild. And, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just my grandchild, but everyone else's that I care about, and why, incidentally, I have been devoting so much of my time, effort, and remaining sanity over the years to trying to get the message across in time to avert disaster. Wouldn't it be wonderful, though, if the climate change skeptics were correct? One might even envy their completely optimistic view. But unfortunately, the reality of what is becoming an ever firmer scientific understanding of the matter demonstrates what some of us have been saying for a very long time. The situation is critical, and the consequences of inaction are too terrifying to contemplate. It is all too easy to shrug off what could happen if we fail to stop the world warming by 2 degrees. But you only have to look at a recent report by the World Bank to see how dangerous things could become. It pointed out that if the world were to be on average 4 degrees warmer than in pre-industrial times, the economic and developmental goals we aspire to are frankly unattainable. In fact, it paints a stark and shocking portrait of what it would come to if we carried on with business as usual. From rising sea levels to intense heat waves, and from more droughts to extremes in rainfall, it depicts a very different world, one that suffers the consequences of decisions being made now, which, for the most part, are being decided without due regard for the future and the ultimate price that will be paid. And where will the skeptics be then, I wonder? You won't see them for dust amidst the squawking of millions of chickens coming home to roost? Well, you all know far better than I do that as every day passes, a 2-degree target becomes increasingly difficult to meet. You also know that the longer we leave decisive action, the more of a risk we run of unavoidable feedbacks in the climate system. It seems as if each incremental rise in greenhouse gas levels closes the door on another possible and better future for ourselves and for our descendants. And even with less than 1 degree warming, profound changes are already apparent. Take the record-breaking melt of sea ice in the Arctic last summer. Compared with the previous recorded summer ice minimum in 2007, an additional area of ice larger than Texas melted. It's hard to imagine it, but leading polar experts suggest that the Arctic Ocean could be virtually ice-free during the summer by the end of the decade. This is more than a passing interest. The loss of sea ice will accelerate the further warming of the Arctic, speeding up the melt of ice on Greenland and hastening the thaw of permafrost, thereby releasing billions of tons of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Arctic warming will also affect weather patterns across the Northern Hemisphere, and probably already is. As I say, the threats multiply and go on multiplying. And incidentally, how anyone imagines you can successfully produce enough food under such extreme and unusual circumstances is utterly beyond me. Long ago, I realized that we are now facing a crisis that will be the defining moment for humanity. Why we have not responded with any urgency in the face of such visible warnings, and instead of cutting emissions have actually increased them each year, is utterly incomprehensible to many informed people. I fear that our failure to respond will haunt future generations. At the moment, our rate of consumption of the planet's natural resources, our seeming inability to alter our models for economic growth, and our determination to more or less carry on as usual, seems set to ensure that we will knowingly destroy their tomorrows, all for the short-term gains of our today. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an act of betrayal. It is also, of course, a huge risk. Think for a moment of the impact of climate change, not in scientific terms, but as a doctor would view the problem. Whereas in science, a hypothesis is tested until absolute proof is secured, in medicine, there is no time to be absolutely certain. If a child is presented to a doctor with a fever, the doctor cannot wait until results of tests come back from the lab. The doctor must act on what evidence is already there. There is an urgency, and it depends upon the risk involved. And given that this is the greatest risk we have ever faced, surely, as the doctor, we cannot wait to act. The symptoms are very clear. The models have become ever more precise. If we see the planet as our patient, the risk of delay is so enormous, we cannot wait until we are absolutely sure the patient is dying. That is a monumental risk no doctor would ever take. The Earth's physical, chemical, and biological systems are crying out to be treated. So we must act now, using a medical model, surely. So, what could a sensible route forward look like? It seems to me that at the heart of our response should be the need for a more joined-up approach, one that crosses boundaries between sectors and which integrates the many critical tasks on the agenda for the coming years. Now, I know that your work this week aims to create a stronger cross-disciplinary approach towards research, and I can only hope that others are inspired to follow your lead, not least, I have to say, on the global stage, where decisions made between now and the second week of December in 2015 will have a profound and definitive impact on our children's and grandchildren's futures. One area, ladies and gentlemen, where it seems to me that a joined-up approach could help stimulate more urgent action is in relation to health. The protection of public health has been a consistently powerful driver of policy, so surely this could be a very positive way of demonstrating to people just how important this issue is. If people see that if we do good to the earth, we improve the health of us all, then a connection that seems hard to establish might become more obvious. For instance, cleaning up the air by switching from coal to renewable energy not only cuts carbon emissions, but also the pollutants that cause respiratory and heart disease. Certainly, if we are to take a much more joined-up approach, then it is imperative that effective steps are taken to integrate international talks on climate change with those on development and food security. In doing so, the world stands a better chance of leaping over the trap of false choices that come about if matters are considered separately. It might also avoid the mire of endless trade-offs. In this sort of new discussion, the different things we need to achieve could be resolved together rather than in isolation, or worse still, in contradiction with one another. So understanding how to do this and bridging the growing chasm that has emerged between science and policy is a vital and urgent task. From what I have seen so far, if there is a determined and collaborative attempt, a new platform for action could be established by 2015. It will not come without effort, but the stakes could not be much higher, nor the time for effective action more slight. We simply have to summon every means to galvanize action. If we approach matters in the correct way, there is still a chance of avoiding disruptive climate change that would offer us an unprecedented opportunity to lay the foundations for a truly sustainable world. It would also make the global economy more stable, healthy, and viable in the long term. Far from being an obstacle to development, comprehensive action to address climate change can be a stimulant to growth. So it must be at the heart of our endeavours to build resilient economies. Thoughtful decision makers across the world know this already, and the role you play, ladies and gentlemen, in defining the scientific map that they need to guide their actions is absolutely crucial. In terms of those not yet moved by the weight of the evidence, your role is even more critical. It is vital that you continue your painstaking work to increase our understanding in order to build the case to the point where even the climate skeptics might, at last, pull their heads out of the sands of denial. It is therefore my most fervent hope that your important deliberations this week will light the fuse that will spur determined and focused action in the months and years ahead.
Now that we were able to enlighten the podium here, I'm honored to welcome Connie Hedegaard, who has been the European Commissioner for Climate Action since 2010. Before, she was Danish Minister for Climate and Energy and Danish Minister for the Environment. And on behalf of Denmark, she hosted the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen in 2009. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the welcome, Minister Kunst, Madam Vice President, dear Rachel. Professor Schellnhuber, thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this. And I must say it's quite a daunting task to come after such an eloquent speech and such an enlightened speech as we just heard. And I think that, I know I've been asked to say something about the EU adaptation plan. And I will promise that I will do that, but I have a few other points I would like to start with. And I think one of them could link to what we just heard from the Prince of Wales. This picture about when we hear from science. They really tell us what to do, in the case of the doctor and our children. And then this very strange thing that seems to apply for climate science, that there you can question basically everything. Just mentioned at the press conference this weekend in Denmark, my country, several of the major newspapers had these very big headlines, as if now the fight against climate change had been cancelled. That was one. And the other said that at least the fight can be postponed. And you literally heard this sigh of relief. There had been this small thing in some scientific reports saying that maybe we do not have to treat this as urgent as we have thought. And so it's as if people just feel relaxed, lean back, and that is a strange psychology, because if you read what was there with small print, it was very clear that the message was the only thing that means is that maybe now we actually have a chance to stay below the 2 degrees, provided we get started right away. But I think that's a new scientific field for you, Mr. Schellnhuber, and your colleagues. How come that man is constructed so that we so much want to hear only the positive news that can tell us how to be complacent? I think that is quite a challenge for us as politicians. How come when science gives us these small indications we could lean back, then we do that, whereas if science next week tell us that there is absolutely no reason to be complacent, and they repeat the message that we have heard time again, how urgent it is to act, then it is as difficult as it is. But I think here we have a very joint challenge, the scientific community and the community of politicians. Because particularly in a time of crisis, where people are so much, also for good reasons, focused on the short-term challenges, the economy, the jobs, all these kind of things, then we as politicians who have an obligation, I believe, a moral responsibility to also think for the longer term, we need to have the facts not only for ourselves, we also need to have the facts communicated to the citizens that we represent so that they will accept that we are thinking and taking decisions for the longer term, and so that we are not being blocked by this. I think here we have a very, very complex issue, how to communicate the things we actually know about climate change. I know that Professor Schellnhuber and a lot of people who are here, because else you would not be here, you are doing this already. But we just have to understand that each day you have new young generations coming out there, and they need time and time and time again to have the message that yes, climate change is still there. This is actually how we try to see it in the European Commission. We try to take our point of departure from the fact that we do not only in Europe have an economic crisis, we have 3 crises. We have an economic crisis, clearly. We definitely also do have a social and job crisis with now more than 26 million Europeans out of job. But while we are busy handling these 2 crises, it does not mean that the 3rd crisis, the climate and energy crisis, solve itself. And we believe that the intelligent way for us as politicians and economic society also to address these challenges, that is to try to do it in a coherent way, to address all the 3 challenges at once. A very good example is efficiency. Of course, if we address efficiency, we do something good for our economy, we can create local jobs, and at the same time we can do something about our energy dependency and climate. And that is why I was also very pleased to see last week that despite all the other things on their plate, the heads of states of Europe actually gave a green light to the Commission's Green Paper on 2030, where we have said it's high time now, also for us in Europe, to start to think beyond 2020. For an investor, 2020 is just around the corner. We must now define our targets for 2030. And the good news of last week was that all the 27 heads of states of Europe said, go ahead, and please come up with concrete proposals before the end of this year. Then we, the heads of state, will come back to this issue March 2014. I think that is very encouraging, and I hope that the business community will also understand the necessity of this, because during these times of crisis, there has been an unfortunate tendency to try to define competitiveness too narrow, as if that's only about the price of labor or the price of any commodity. But what we have been very good at in Europe, that has also been to have economic growth and environmental policies to go hand in hand. To me, that is a core European value, and I always thought that that was not just a core European value in the good times. It must also be a core European value when we are challenged economically. So I just think that we have to continue this focus on efficiency, resource efficiency also, even if we are getting the prospect now of having cheaper energy. I know that some think also in this country, maybe if we just extract all the energy that is now there, and we could get cheap energy, why then bother about efficiency and resources? Well, because we are becoming still more people, asking for still more commodities, asking for still more growth. That is why, even if we did not have a climate challenge on top of all these other challenges, we would still have to look for a much more sustainable economic model. We are trying to address this, as I said, coherently in the European Commission, and one of the ways you can see this is through the next budget, where we have actually managed so far to have also the backing of all the member states, that in the next European budget, at least 20% of the whole envelope will be spent in a way that promote our climate and energy targets. That is not a small thing. It's extremely important because it means something for how we think our economy, for how we take our decisions, that already from the very outset we say we must take care to mainstream climate thinking into our economy, into our budgets. I could say a lot more about mitigation. Time will not allow that, and therefore I will now turn to adaptation, but just to say that it goes without saying that when now we are focusing adaptation, it is of course not because we have given up on mitigation in Europe. These two things must go hand in hand. By acting now, and that goes for mitigation as well as adaptation, we can prevent heavy damage costs later. And quite literally, we can save lives too. Prevention is better than cure. But I must say that even with the best mitigation policies, what we can see now is that we will be in for quite dramatic adaptation challenges also in Europe. And that is, of course, why it is time for us to start to address that in a much more systematic way in Europe. As we heard the Prince of Wales say, to continue business as usual, that will come with a lot of consequences. And I think that is challenging the normal way we think about economy and about budget. It's also challenging for finance ministers. There is a tendency to believe that if we just do tomorrow what we used to do yesterday, it cannot be more expensive. Well, in climate change, it can be a lot more expensive. And that is also what our findings around the adaptation strategy really showed. We also believe that it goes for adaptation as well as for mitigation, that we have the potential of creating a significant amount of jobs in Europe if we get it right with our adaptation technologies. So it's just to say, it's not just win-win, it's also a lot of investments, it's a lot of things we have to do, but if we do it right and if we do it intelligently, then there is actually also some rather important co-benefits to be had. We believe that adaptation will bring innovation and new opportunities. I could just mention sectors like construction, insurance, water management, ecosystem management, and agricultural technologies. But it's of course clear that when we talk about adaptation strategies in Europe, there are huge national and, for that matter, regional differences. And therefore, some would ask, but why a European adaptation strategy? What is the added value of that? Well, it goes without saying that a European adaptation strategy cannot and should not be very prescriptive. It would not make any sense. But what we can do is to make the EU adaptation strategy a catalyst that supports the needs of member states as well as of businesses and local stakeholders. And I would say that in the strategy we have presented, we have three main objectives. First, to promote action in all member states. The truth is that today only 15 of our 27 member states have an adaptation strategy. The last time Professor Schellnhuber and I were together not too long ago in Brussels, I said 14. Now we have one more, so they are coming. But still, we have almost half of our member states without a national adaptation strategy. The second main objective is to improve decision-making about adaptation. And certainly it is to make EU-level policies and projects more resilient to climate change. So what does this mean in terms of action? Well, as I mentioned, first we want to see all member states adopt adaptation strategies, and we have set sort of a deadline, 2017. I think that's fair to say you have still 4 years, but if not, then we have to review this and see whether it has to be an obligation at the EU level to have a national strategy. We also plan to promote adaptation action in towns and cities. We are going to launch an initiative modeled on the Covenant of Mayors. It's a cooperation between a lot of cities and mayors around Europe, which has seen more than 4,500 municipalities commit voluntarily to meet or exceed the EU's climate and energy targets for 2020. So to make something together with this forum on adaptation is quite a substantial potential there is there. Second, when it comes to improving decision-making, we want to further develop the Climate Adapt platform as the one-stop shop for adaptation-related information in Europe. We also intend to address the many gaps in current knowledge, and I'll come back to that point in just a minute. And the third point, that we will further mainstream adaptation into EU policies and relevant EU-funded projects through a regular appraisal exercise and through guidelines we have provided as part of this strategy. It goes without saying, if we are supporting through EU funds, say for instance an infrastructure project, could be a highway, it could be a railway, it could be whatever, it would be wrong not already to include what we know about weather patterns in the future so that we climate-proof the project from the very outset. We aim in this context to make our infrastructure more resilient through further work also with the private sector. And this includes public-private cooperation in reviewing design standards and codes to make newly built infrastructure much more resilient to the changing climate conditions. We also want to boost the role of the insurance sector to adaptation. Some tentative questions on how this could be done has already been communicated in a green paper my colleague responsible for this area presented some weeks ago together with the adaptation package, and to which stakeholders are very much invited now to comment how best to include the insurance sector. And finally, the strategy also contains documents that provide complementary assessments or guidance to member states. That can be on coastal areas, that can be on fishery policies. That is where we can make a difference as the European Union. We can try and come with all the combined knowledge we have and make that a resource for those out locally trying to address adaptation policies. Uncertainty is the barrier most often quoted as the reason for not taking action on adaptation. Despite huge progress in recent years, there are still gaps in our knowledge across the whole adaptation cycle, from the observation of impacts right through to effective adaptation. So improving our knowledge is key to stepping up action. And one of the tools we have for that we call Climate Adapt. I mentioned it just before. It is a web-based tool where not only all our municipalities, our member states, our regions, can come up with their best practices and, for that matter, worst practices, but it's also open to companies with good solutions. And that means that if you are living in an area where you just had a big flood, you can go in and you can find exactly out who have been through the same kind of challenge, what were the solutions they applied, what worked, what did not work, which companies to turn to, and so on and so forth. So that's a very efficient way so that we do not have to reinvent the wheel, all of us. One of my hobby horses is that we are very, very bad in Europe to learn from one another. Everyone thinks that they have to reinvent the wheel, and sometimes when you go out and you meet a mayor and he tells you what they are doing, and you say, yes, I know, your neighboring community, they did that 10 years ago, and they sometimes even don't know. We should be much faster at applying good practices. So that's one thing we can do, and the Climate Adapt is a very strong tool for that. Second, the strategy will also launch a process to identify and prioritize gaps in current knowledge. So where there is knowledge enough, that we sort of can initiate that, and I'll come back to exactly how. And the Commission's Joint Research Centre will help in this endeavour by filling knowledge gaps, for example, by compiling EU-wide vulnerability data, by assessing climate change impacts in Europe, and through projects such as PESETA. And information from this Joint Research Centre has provided an important input to the preparation of the EU adaptation strategy. So that's just one example how the scientific community and the policymakers are working together. I said I would come back to, and that's just my last point, that is, of course, funding. How do we do that? That is also absolutely key here. That's why the Commission has included adaptation in its proposals for all relevant EU finance programs, as I mentioned, in the next 7-year budget. That goes for all areas. That also goes for greening of the agricultural policies. It goes for research. It goes for transport. It goes across all the different sectorial areas. It also goes for the European Structural and Investment Funds, because in the new budget they will provide significant support to member states, regions and cities for integrating adaptation into programs and projects. And when I mentioned research and development, and I mentioned this figure of 20% mainstreaming, actually in this Horizon 2020, the research program of the European Union, there we have already decided that 35% of that whole envelope will have to help us know more in the climate field. It's a very, very substantial increase that I think will also be very interesting for researchers also present in this room. And the last thing I would just mention is the LIFE Fund for environmental projects, because there we will also see a very significant increase in the climate part of that to, in the next budget, 850 million euros. I could say also a lot about the international thing and adaptation. I will not do that. I will just mention, because I know that in Germany, at least, it has been part of the considerations about the EU adaptation strategy, whether it should also not be aimed at our international adaptation policies. We have decided that that is for the international negotiations. We have strategies for that. We have an adaptation framework made already internationally. We are now in Warsaw later this year discussing loss and damage. There is adaptation funding being discussed. So we must definitely also discuss adaptation as well, of course, as mitigation at the international level. But the EU adaptation strategy is first and foremost about how to adapt in Europe. My very last point is, I believe, in line with where I started, that the very big challenge for us as politicians, for the civil servants systems, for business, maybe also for the scientific community, that is how in practice to think across the different silos, the different portfolios. And I can say for sure that that is a challenge for the political system. We are trying to address this in the Commission by working rather close across the board. For instance, I work very much with my colleagues, the colleague responsible for resilience, the colleague responsible for development, and maybe we can come back to this in the debate, because I think that one of the ways we need in order to get enough international financing for adaptation, that is that it's not a taboo to say that it's of course good if €1 or $1 spent can hit several purposes at the same time. I basically believe that's the only way you can make, say, Ethiopia and a lot of other very vulnerable countries resilient enough, adapting enough to climate change, addressing the mitigation, and at the same time getting access to energy and getting development. So I think that there are lots of challenges ahead, but I think in this very challenging, complex world, where I dare say that it is not easy days to have political responsibilities. Our governments have their hands full with a lot of day-to-day business. I think that the more the scientific community and the political community understand not always to do exactly the same, but to listen to one another, and politicians to listen to the input, the facts, the knowledge we get to science, and then try to base our politics on facts, on how the world actually is and what we know about how it will be, instead of only doing what we think would be nice to do in the very short term. The more we understand this, the more the scientific facts can be communicated, the better decision making we will be able to take in the longer term. And as I think I have said, the longer term thinking is really needed to replace this tendency of too much short-termism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hedegaard, for this inspiring perspective, or talk from the European perspective. We have time for 2 or 3 questions now directly to this talk. So please raise your hand. Yes, please, over there. Please make yourself known with your institution as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is John Porter. I'm from the University of Copenhagen, so tak skal du have, as they say. I was just thinking what links what Prince Charles was saying with what we've heard also from the other speakers. And one of the things I think is that what we're really dealing here now with is an issue really of human rights. It's a different form of human rights. I mean, we have thought of human rights in the past as freedom from discrimination and segregation, but we also have a human right, I think, in the future to live in a world which is free from a threat from climate change. And one of the things I think hasn't really been used as the armory, if you like, of trying to change people's minds, because that's basically what we're trying to do, is looking at it through the legal viewpoint. Is there a way in which one could use the legal system to mount some kind of human rights legislation which would in some way ensure that people were able to have lives which are free from any threat from climate change? So that's just a thought and a question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very easy question. You know, one of the things that are being discussed internationally is this about climate justice. And I think you are sort of referring to something like that. The challenge there, of course, is that when we see how difficult it is globally, internationally, to agree on all the things we can see it's difficult to agree on, it's also clear that to define exactly what is climate justice is going to be extremely challenging. So I'm not saying that that should not be part of the thinking, and it is definitely part of the negotiations and part of the debate. It's just we should not fool ourselves and think that that is sort of an easy way, and then we can sort of come forward with what is then the just solution. Because, for instance, just to show you one of the examples of what we're dealing with, that's then the historical responsibility. Which weight should the historical responsibility have? So I think that everyone can see how this is challenging. But just one final thing on this, you mentioned sort of the right in the future to have a world without too many climate challenges. It is sort of weird, isn't it, that it seems that everybody these days in Europe would agree that there is a limit to how much economic debt you can give hand on to the next generation. How come that we cannot have the same kind of thinking about climate change? Because in the end, that is weighing down the future economic freedom of future generations. So I think that there is also an aspect we should emphasize more in the debate.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, please.
I'm Cynthia Rosenzweig from NASA and Columbia University in New York. You mentioned, Commissioner Hedegaard, you mentioned the role of cities. And with colleagues from cities around the world, we formed the Urban Climate Change Research Network and are even creating an IPCC for cities, because cities are emerging as the first responders. It seems to be the right level of governance, both for the mitigation side, so much of economic activity is in cities, as well as the adaptation side. Certainly all the coastal cities are very much on the front line, but also they experience their citizens having to deal with the impacts. So could you elaborate on your remarks on that to see how in the international negotiations, which are so focused on the nation states, but clearly a rebalancing of responsibility, financing, and working together across the jurisdictions is really needed? Thank you.
I think that's an extremely important point. And not to be polemic about the US, but it goes without saying that also in the US you can sometimes see action at city level that is much more difficult to see at the federal level. And that we also see in Europe in the sense that here the municipality is closer to the citizens. So it makes more sense, to communicate exactly what is all this about. We are having a communication campaign right now running from the European Commission, A World You Like with a Climate You Like, where we try to sort of emphasize all the positive solutions out there, all the co-benefits if we get it right about climate change. And I don't say that that cannot move anything. It can, but it's clear that what you can do from Brussels to 27 different nation states, that is tiny, tiny compared to where people actually live and where the distance to the citizens who actually have to change their behavior is much, much smaller. I actually didn't know that you were preparing an IPCC-like thing for citizens. I think it would be extremely important afterwards to hear more about that, because as I said, we would try to include the Covenant of Mayors much more in that, because they know exactly what to do. If I could have time just to mention, last 2 years ago, Copenhagen almost looked like Venice for some days in July because of some very, very heavy precipitation. And in the run-up to the COP15 in Copenhagen, one would have thought everyone in Denmark knew everything about climate change. And they knew everything about, in Denmark, and here where we are here, climate change will come in the form of more heavy precipitation during summers. And yet people say, wow, where did all that water come from? How come? Only when they stood there in their basements and had water to up their knees and all their papers and old pictures were drowning, then people start to understand what is all this about. To avoid that, all of us will have to stand in our basements before we start to act. I think that the cities have a potential of getting the message across.
Thank you very much. We'll move on now. There will be more time for questions at the end of this session. So thanks again for these questions and the replies. We're now happy to have Rachel Kyte with us. She is Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank, where she has overall responsibilities for the organization's global work in agriculture, environment, energy, infrastructure, urban and social development, along with global public goods issues in those areas. Prior to her appointment in 2011, she was the International Finance Corporation's Vice President for Business Advisory Services and a member of IFC's management team. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the great honour of being here today. I'm delighted to be on stage with Professor Schellnhuber and Connie Hedegaard, and I hope that I can round out this discussion with a global perspective. I rarely get to speak to a large gathering with whom we share so much in terms of a common vision and with people who I believe are just as dedicated to changing the vision of the potential vision that we can all have for this planet as you are with where I think we are as a World Bank group today. So not just standing in front of you and standing next to John Schellnhuber, I really want to publicly thank him and his colleagues for everything that they've done for us in the last year and everything that they did in the work that we commissioned, which came out in the report that he already mentioned, Turn Down the Heat. It was published just a few months ago, but has had an enormous impact, I think, globally, but also on us and other institutions like us. This report, a commissioned report of science, remember we're an economic-based organisation, reached more people than any study the bank has ever published on anything. It appeared in nearly 2,000 news outlets, resulted in more than 13,000 mentions in the first 2 weeks. And we estimate, using all of the new technology that you can do for these things, that it has reached more than 1 billion people. For us, Turn Down the Heat was a lesson in more effective communication. If we can continue to communicate in language and idioms that are easily understood, as in that report, we can nurture new support for the work ahead of us. We will be able to speak to those who are outside of this room, who are not yet converted, who haven't yet stood in a basement up to their knees in floodwater. The subtitle of that report was Why a 4-degree warmer world must be avoided. The 4-degree scenarios that were presented were, according to my boss, our president, devastating. Unprecedented heat waves, droughts, superstorms, record-breaking floods. This is all the vision of a 4-degree world. But for us, in the World Bank Group, it's more than that. It's that in a 4-degree world, even in the 2-degree world, even in the 0.8-degree world, we are acutely aware that it is the poor who are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Our ultimate client, the poor. It is the poor that will be hit first, and they will be hit hardest. They are being hit first. They are being hit hardest. The poor are the people that we've been working for the last 66 years. The bank and our partners have had quite some success in those years. Between 1990 and 2010, 663 million people moved above the absolute poverty line. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of millions of people have lives that are better and brighter than they had dared hope. And they have dared to have even grander hopes for their children. Climate change is a machine. It's a machine that will grind these people back into extreme poverty, or worse, it will slam the lid on poverty reduction efforts for decades. We refuse to let that happen. As a result, we will use every tool we can get our hands on to prevent that from happening. And that's why I am here today, why the World Bank Group would be at such a science conference as this. We are, of course, an economic-based institution, but we have taken the science, your work, and used it to try to open a bigger space for different kinds of conversations to inform development and economic and financial planning. For the bank, climate change is a development imperative, an economic imperative, and also a moral imperative. Our mission is fundamentally changing. What we're doing now is putting a lens of climate on all of our agricultural work, our transport work, our energy work, saying, okay, is everything that we're doing really climate smart? The World Bankers Group is changing because of the work done by you, your colleagues, the people in this room. I'm not saying we're all the way there yet, but I am saying that we're changing. We talked earlier about risk, and we also mentioned uncertainty. I think it's true that for our clients, for the countries in which we work, risk is something that they are beginning to be able to think through and manage. The economic and financial tools, the private sector in these countries are starting to be able to factor risk in. But uncertainty, as challenging as it is in Europe, is even more challenging in countries with much less tools at their disposal for long-term policy making. And as colleagues in the private sector always remind me, Rachel, we can price risk. We don't know how to price uncertainty. And so our work, you as scientists, us as economic-based policy advisors, is to try to find ways to narrow the uncertainty so that long-term planning can go ahead. So I'm delighted when I look at the goals of this meeting, and I wish you good work. Your work is critical to us. It is where the rubber meets the road. But if you'll permit me, I have a few small suggestions to add to your agenda. You didn't think I'd come here without any, did you? First, be nimble. Impact science and climate change are moving very fast. Just in the course of this month, we've had new and important data. For example, on ocean acidification, we learned that the acidity of surface ocean waters worldwide is now 30% higher than at the start of the Industrial Revolution. Precisely what impact this acidification will have is not known, but it's likely to impact the abundance, productivity and distribution of marine species. That is the protein source for the world's poor. Also this month, researchers from Scripps published a paper about short-lived climate pollutants, such as the black carbon emitted from burning diesel fuel. The study used a coupled ocean atmosphere climate model to show that the SLCP mitigation can slow sea level rise by 24 to 50% and cut cumulative sea level rise by as much as 42%. For our clients, this could be the difference between survival and devastation. The challenge we have for science is how do we take new information like this and operationalise it? This is the kind of evidence-based guidance that we need in order to be able to work with our clients. A second small suggestion I have is to ask you to communicate with the rest of us more and differently. We understand that there is a specialised tradition of communication in your community and that this method has been an essential component to progress. But you don't talk to finance ministers. We do. Let me tell you, they come to us and ask, what's this all about? Why does this matter to me? How does this change what I invest in and when? Your work is important and your communications traditions are central to progress, but your work needs to be presented in a way that people who are not used to this complex and precise language can be used to help them make decisions. Write often, publish quickly, have it packaged for easy consumption by people who are foreigners to your world, like us, bankers. Doing it will pay off. I don't talk about climate change with my clients. I talk about food security. I talk about the gap in energy access. I talk about water scarcity. I talk about how all three interplay together. And I talk about fiscal pressure from the wrong subsidies applied. How to make long-term decisions in short-term political cycles with weak civil services is the struggle that many of my clients face. I think it will pay off, and I think there's also an audience in the private sector where I see enormous progress and much of your science coming to play and being used in very creative decision-making. I'll give you an example. Ocean ports are very expensive installations, some of the most expensive infrastructure exposed to climate change. Managers of these ports need to know how to adapt. A private firm which manages the port of Cartagena in Colombia wanted to understand what climate change would do to their operations, not just oceanside, but landside, and how they could adapt. With help from us, They conducted a study which examined the impact of sea level rise, land inundation, and the potential of landslides. The study concluded with recommendations that included improving drainage, changing the dredging regime for the approach of ships, and raising the height of a road. Based on the collection of this data, mind you, from over 25 different sources at the national level, the Cartagena Port Management invested $30 million to protect its operations from risks. Moreover, as a result of doing that, port managers around the world are now following their example. So your data, your evidence, your science, conveyed in a slightly different way or with the help of others who know how to build on it, can have immediate impact in investment decision making. The World Bank Group realizes that adaptation and mitigation, especially in impoverished countries, is going to be expensive. Not everything that needs to be done can be paid for from the deep pockets of port managers. To help finance adaptation and mitigation, we have created new funds to channel public money to leverage private money. To date, through the climate investment funds, we've committed about $7 billion in 48 countries, leveraging $43 billion for investments in clean energy and adaptation, especially in low-income countries. For our own account, together with other multilateral development banks, last year we spent $20 billion. But this is but a drop in the ocean. Give us the evidence, and your work can be translated into actions that can save and even improve lives. Your professional elders may have been forced to wait a lifetime to see their work impact lives. It's very likely that you won't have to. And my final small suggestion is to not lose sight of the possibility of not just avoiding doom, but of improving lives. It's easy to lose sight of this possibility of a better future when we're so focused on droughts, heat waves, rising seas, and superstorms. But if we use this time wisely, the future can be brighter than the one most people envisage today. And the communication is around not only using the data and evidence to grab people's attention and to scare them, because we are emotional animals and each one of our emotions will have to be brought to the fore, but to give people a sense of what could be done differently, what a different tax regime could mean for their future, that there are jobs to be had out there in a different, greener and more competitive economy, that there is a future if one is investing in resilience now. People need to see what this different, potentially better world might look like and where they will fit in it. So we have plenty of work ahead, difficult, complicated work, and we're in a race against a gathering storm. Little of the work will have any certain answer. We must make decisions, big decisions, amid that daunting uncertainty, and we have to make the decisions fast. The question is, can you help us? At the bank, we've never shied away from big problems. Right now, we have a goal of eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. Ambitious? Yes. Quixotic? I don't think so. The goal is, in fact, within our grasp, but the list of challenges is long. First, we have to understand how to build resilient countries, communities, cities. Honestly, we don't know enough about what makes communities resilient. What makes one community do well after a disaster while another fails? How much of that is predictive? What are the components of success and failure? Disasters are often followed by an outpouring of humanitarian response. But what is the smart way to build resilience? We believe that if we spend more on resilience, we would have to spend less on relief. Can you help us understand how best to do that? Development today is all about resilience, and I completely agree with Connie in terms of the use of funds, whether they come from development or climate sources, really being about resilient development. All the infrastructure we have to build has to be resilient. We must never use development money to build stranded assets. We must never throw bad money after good. We also need to build the next generation of carbon markets and get to a robust price on carbon. In fact, it's one of the most essential things to do in order to move at speed. What are the research possibilities for that? How do we make that more likely or quickly? With a robust price on carbon, we can get business incentives moving in the right direction. What would that take? Right now, 26 countries are developing domestic market mechanisms. How can we catalyse those efforts? Of course, everybody looks to Europe and then sometimes looks away. But there's a flat world out there and a lot of progress and a lot of hope. Next on the list, fossil fuel subsidies, consuming $1.9 trillion a year. It's not only regressive, it's a complete waste of money that could be used for much better purposes if redirected. Subsidies encourage excessive energy consumption and reduce the incentives to invest in alternatives. Countries understand these subsidies must end, but they need help. They feel the fiscal pressure, but they need help to put in place first safety nets that will ensure that the poor will not be sacrificed as you shift subsidies. They need help in the politics, and they need help in the communication. And we need to transform agriculture so that carbon will be sequestered while farmers increase their incomes. New heat and drought-resistant crops are under development, but are we researching the right things? The obsession with crop-specific research, is that really what we need today? If wheat is a thirsty crop in a world where we know that 2.8 billion people will be living in a water-stressed environment within 10 years, are we just moving the chairs around on the deck of the Titanic if we try to make wheat better? Should research be focused on the systems themselves and making the systems more resilient? There's probably not one or the other, but are we really looking in the right place? In one way or another, farmers have to be shown that downloading carbon can be done while reaping a nutritious harvest and generating a livable income. Can you help? Now, I'm not suggesting that I go and start talking to a farmer about a global public good issue of GHG emissions. I will talk to the farmer about price and about yield and about income. But if in doing something different, he can have an impact on, or she can have an impact on GHG emissions, then so be it for the better. Tomorrow I will launch in Vienna a new report which creates the global baseline data for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. Universal access, doubled share of renewables from 18% to 36% by 2030, and doubled energy efficiency improvement. For the last 5 years, the bank has doubled its commitments to renewables, and now about 50% of our energy commitments are renewable. But can you help us open new paths to clean energy? The tendency in my organisation and others like us is that when we think big and bold, we think literally big and bold. But perhaps the biggest and boldest thing here will be distributed energy globally for so many who do not have access today. And then Connie already mentioned cities, and you did too. Cities account for 2/3 of energy consumption, 70% of global emissions, and that's where everybody's going to be living going forward. Can you show us how to efficiently cut that number and do it with the speed and scale that has eluded us until now? I agree with you that cities are the unit of account, which makes a lot of sense. But let me tell you, in all the work and the fantastic policy work that's done in the last 10 years, we've led to now a group of cities around the world that have some form of carbon planning. Some cities have a climate mitigation plan. Some cities have a climate resilience plan. Some cities have both. But if you look globally at that subset of cities, about 61 that have some form of planning which is fit for purpose, and you look at the ones in the developing world, and then you look at the ones which are creditworthy in the developing world, you can count them on the fingers of this one hand. And so if we're going to invest in the assets, the resilient assets of the cities of the future so that they will be livable, where you can live with dignity, then we've got an awful lot of basic work to be done to make cities actually the places where you can invest. Because just focusing on whether or not they've got the climate plans is not going to be a sufficient answer. We will not be able to attract private capital into cities without that. My suggestion is that that's something that we can do alongside those of you who are working with them on the climate side, and let's put them through creditworthiness boot camp and get them ready for the investment that should flow as a result of their climate planning. The list goes on. There are so many things that will need to be done over the next decade. And I'm certain that we will achieve each of these goals. We're not on the losing side of this effort. Every drought, every spike in the cost of food and energy will bring new support to this effort, especially when it hurts the elite. The elite are, after all, so much less resilient than the poor. As our President said, extreme weather will continue to create a very powerful understanding of what is happening. When that political support reaches a critical mass, we have to be ready to say what options are available, what options can we provide, what models will be proven successful, what new understanding will be opening opportunities. The moment that an extreme weather event tips the balance from not just 6 weeks in the news like Sandy was, but to a real understanding that something profound has to change now, and that will be because the rich and the elite were hurt as much as the poor. If we are not ready with the answers, the world will look away, and the world will look somewhere else for answers. And God forbid that the world would look to somebody other than the science community for the answers. That is the challenge for you and for us. My conviction, the bank's conviction, does not come from hubris or from arrogance. It comes from a deeply rooted belief that smart and motivated people will, have done, and will continue to change history. We can do this, but it can only be done together. Thank you for everything that you've done, for your commitment and for your passion, and for allowing us to take your work and try to make something of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these challenges and very deep questions you put forward to this conference. Again, we have time for 2 or 3 questions. So, yes, here in the front.
Philip Santos from Lisbon University. Well, thank you for your very interesting presentation. Of course, it has already been said that climate change is a complex problem and that there are many uncertainties. However, let me say something that is obvious, but in any case, I'll say it. If we accept physics, the physics of the problem, then one concludes that the current increase in the use of fossil fuels is impossible in the way to solve the problem. I mean, in other words, the problem cannot be solved with that trend. So my question would be if in all the efforts that the World Bank does in order to promote sustainable development and being aware of all the global changes that are involved and the interactions between problems relating to water and energy and food security and so on, do you really think that solutions to climate change can come from an incremental endeavor, incremental endeavors, or that you need to promote more radical transformational policies?
That's a tough one. We have the honour and the privilege, but also the difficulty of sitting where science and politics intersect, just like Connie does. And I think that in a world which is as unequal as ours, the world has become more equal, but countries are becoming more unequal. And in a world where you have this inequality, and you have more than 1 billion people living without access to any form of electricity or power, it's quite hard to stand and say current market prices, you just have to wait a little bit longer and a few more years until we can get you power that is renewable. And that's really what it's coming down to, is what are the things that we know? We know that you will not grow your economy unless you have access to power. And so most countries aspire to getting access to power. Most politicians run for office promising that they will bring power to the people if the people don't have power. And most politicians lose office if they don't bring that power. And so then the question is, how can we marshal the financing to make sure that the energy mix is going to shift to be a cleaner one over time? And then the question is, how radically do you want to make that cleanness over time happen? And that depends on financing as well as other things. And there are historical analogies where where those with resources have paid those without resources to not do something. So I remember in the 80s, I think the Norwegians decided not to spend more money in Norway on sort of forest protection, but to simply help Poland put scrubbers on their power plants, because that's where the acid rain was coming from. So, where there are coal-fired power plants which are on stream, you could pay people not to build them, and you could pay people to find other sources of energy. But that isn't happening in a world where the economic growth is slowing down. But the other way to look at it is that even if you installed power for that 1.2 billion people today, it would be less than 1% of global emissions. So you apply a materiality test. And I think one of the jeopardies for us as an institution is that we provide knowledge, advice, and technical services to a certain set of countries, but not to another set. Today we do not lend in Ohio, and I do not provide technical assistance to Florida. And so the problem that we have is that we can be, at our worst, prescriptive, but we can be persuasive in the developing world, but we can only use our bully pulpit for the developed world. But we want to use the global office that we have as a bank group to point out that it is the 20 countries that are producing most of the emissions that have to have the aggressive reduction. It doesn't mean that the poor should imagine growing dirty and cleaning up green. The Kuznets curve, the famous economic principle, that has been disproven. We think we can show that there's a better way to do that. But I think that's one of the jeopardies of this issue. So I don't think we will do very much coal going forward, because it is not the best option for most of these countries. But it's going to take more money to provide all of the other options. For Africa, gas will replace coal. Gas is better than coal. Is gas as good as geothermal or solar or wind? No, but it's how quickly can we move Africa through an energy transition? These are the questions where the rubber hits the road.
So let's have two more brief questions. One is back there. Yes.
Ian Noble, climate scientist and formerly World Bank. Having Commissioner Hedegaard and Rachel Kyte on the same stage makes me ask this question. I've had reason to be thinking seriously about the Green Climate Fund and how it might be structured. Now, most of you will know that all countries are signed on to this. We're talking about ambitious $100 billion per year by 2020, but this should be new and additional funds. And we are going to be held to that point by developing countries. Now, Rachel, you made the point that climate change, adaptation and development are inextricably linked. Do you think we will be able to find a way to satisfy the requirements that developing countries are insisting on in this situation? Or do we think that we'll find a way around this? Do you think there'll be a solution? Will this become as irrelevant maybe as the 18th century debate on how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? But it is a challenge that has to be solved, and will have to be solved fairly quickly. Are we moving towards steps to solve that problem?
Let me take the last question and we answer together. So it's over there, that difference.
Philip Sprintz, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. You mentioned that there is a long-term challenge and short-term decision-making cycles. How do you reconcile both, especially how do you then add credibility to your long-term goal, for instance, on climate change?
So I'll go first, and then the winner of the Eurovision Song Contest can clean up after me. We gave you 12 points, by the way. So anyway, just on the second point, I think that what's really important is where there is the private, the private good, to really accentuate that over perhaps the public good in communication and in making the case for a policy action. So investing in new, transit and urban systems, which are extremely expensive and disruptive, and taxes may have to go up for it. The reason to do it is because kids will breathe cleaner air, the poor will get to work more quickly and be productive, the city's competitiveness will improve, it will attract more investment. Oh, and by the way, emissions will go down. That's not the selling point. If you talk to successful politicians, as well as Connie, so if you talk to those in Australia that introduced the emissions trading scheme, although that's going to have an interesting September, and you talk to successful politicians in the United States, the words climate change never pass their lips. Never. I mean, they talk about clean energy, or they talk about children's health, and most successful mayors in the developing world as well that have undertaken large capital investment schemes have done so for the same way. So I think that's the closest way we have to bridge the short-term political with the long-term cycle of climate change. On the Green Climate Fund, well, the short answer, Ian, would be, well, we're going to see, aren't we? I think that the analysis of the sources of funds, the transmission mechanisms of funds, and then the uses of funds was a useful one. And I still use that in a way to think through what is the conundrum. So the uses of funds, as I said, in least developed countries, in poor countries, who are dependent upon aid resources, that aid has to be spent on things which are smart from an adaptation perspective. You can't not do that. So that's a sort of a combination of analysis. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be topping up the aid money with the necessary adaptation funds, because aid will be more expensive as a result. The upfront capital cost of some of these investments will be higher. The transmission mechanisms, the Green Climate Fund, needs to be a success in order to bolster the confidence, if nothing more, of negotiators in the UN Framework Convention. But, if you think about the Green Climate Fund as a pension fund for the planet, or an endowment for the planet, you wouldn't put all your money in one basket. You would never give your entire savings to one asset manager. Or if you did, you'd only have yourself to blame. And so we need to allow the Green Climate Fund to leverage as much private investment from as many different models as possible. And the countries need to be able to invest, domestically and bilaterally in any other way. We don't want a fragmentation of funds, but we don't want to put everything in one basket as well. And then when I think that the climate finance and overseas development assistance are under extreme pressure in most of the countries that have to give and have made commitments. I don't doubt the political commitment in most of these countries, but I feel their pain. And so the way in which we can open up the, your pension and my pension, and make the case that there is the not taking into account climate impacts in the investment of each of our pension funds is really short term, because those pension funds have to invest with a climate lens on them in order to have the return to the ultimate beneficiary. Some countries have already allowed the caps to go up, right? I think Australia now, New Zealand, the pension funds can invest up to 15% in sort of sustainable infrastructure, which at the end of the day is the kind of stuff that we're talking about from a climate perspective in emerging markets. And I think that there's room for public policy to push institutional investors and others in the right direction. But the Green Climate Fund's role is to be catalytic and is to provide the platforms for that investment to be mobilised and spent. And we'll see whether or not we have the collective ability to do that.
Well, not much to add. I agree very much with what Rachel Kyte just said about not to have only one basket. But the big challenge right now in the Green Climate Fund is that we've heard about this idea since 2009. Now it's soon June 2013. And as far as I hear, they are still having some very interesting discussions in the board but it's not really moving forward. And I think that we will come to crunch time in Warsaw, because impatience will start to grow among the developing countries, because they expect that now there must be a setup there. Exactly what can we count on from that? So that starts to get urgent. My other point is just to re-emphasize what Rachel also mentioned. This $100 billion per year as of 2020, and of course also the build-up to that between now and to 2020. I think that one of the very, very big challenging discussions we have to win there, that is to get much broader understanding that we are not going to make it to $100 billion per year through public finance only. It is about how to find the best possible way to use public finance, which of course has to be there. For instance, in the adaptation field, a lot of it, if not all of it, will have to be very much public finance. But how can we use the public money to leverage private investments? And when we are talking about, say, access to sustainable energy in Africa, how can we use public money to take away the risk from some of the pension funds or whoever it is, to get a more sort of normal debate around these things instead of this ideological debate where some still claim that no, it's only the public money that really counts. We will not make it to the $100 billion without really good solutions where we can show in practice that the public money is leveraging real new private investments that would else not come. I think that's where the very big job is, and we have started in the context of the Major Economists Forum and some in the donor community to have this discussion, how to come up with the best possible solutions. And there we also need input from people like yourself, from the pension fund community, and they are meeting next month in Hong Kong. But also the World Bank and other financial institutions have some very good examples what could be done.
Thank you very much. So that closes the opening session. So let's have a round of applause for our speakers. Thanks very much. We are now having a coffee break, and I would ask you to reconvene at 5 minutes past 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.